Everyone laughed when the farmer bought an old rusty wind turbine and spent his last money on it. They called him crazy and a fool, laughing right in his face. But what happened next shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The valley stretched beneath a pale and restless sky, hemmed in by low hills that held the morning fog like an old secret. The people who lived there had long ago grown used to sameness, the steady turn of seasons, the brief promise of rain, the gossip that floated between porches and store counters. It was a place where nothing new happened, where memory weighed more than hope, and where silence had learned to disguise itself as contentment. Yet beyond the last cluster of farms, beyond the narrow road that bent toward the abandoned quarry, there stood something that did not belong to the rhythm of the land. A tall, skeletal wind turbine whose rusted blades had not moved in years. Once it had been the pride of the valley. The county had built a row of them 20 years earlier, promising a new age of clean energy and prosperity. But the funding dried up, the engineers left, and the towers were left to rot. The one on the ridge above the Marlowe farm still stood, though tilted slightly, its paint stripped away by wind and time. Crows nested inside the hollow nacelle. When the wind howled through its broken vents, the sound carried like a moan across the wheat fields, half mechanical, half human. People called it the Tower of Dead Wind, and children dared each other to climb its corroded ladder and touch the ghost metal. Elias Marlowe could see the tower from his kitchen window. Each morning as he drank his coffee, his eyes drifted toward it. The habit was old, born of curiosity at first, then hardened into something like companionship. He was a man who had lived through more storms than harvests, a farmer shaped by the dry patience of the earth. His face was weathered. The skin around his eyes burned pale from years of sunlight and solitude. Once there had been laughter in that house, the voice of his wife, the footsteps of his sons, but the years had taken them away one by one. His wife to illness, his boys to cities that glittered too far to imagine. Now only he remained, and the silence that filled the farmhouse seemed heavier with each passing season. The power lines that crossed the valley were as unreliable as the promises of the county council. Every storm meant darkness. Every gust of wind, another night of candles and silence. He had learned to live with it, to store kerosene, to read by the dim orange glow of a lantern while the fields outside drowned in blackness. But as the outages grew longer, something in him began to shift. Perhaps it was weariness, or the dull ache of being forgotten. Perhaps it was the memory of his wife's voice saying once, half in jest, that he was too stubborn to die before fixing everything he touched. Whatever the reason, when he heard that the county planned to dismantle the last of the old turbines for scrap, a thought took hold of him, quietly, absurdly, like a spark in a long-dead fire. He went into town the next morning, driving the same dented pickup that had carried his harvest for 30 years. The men at the feed store were already talking about the demolition. About time they tore down those eyesores, one said, spitting tobacco into a tin can. All they ever did was rattle in the wind and scare the cattle. Another laughed, adding that maybe the steel could be sold off to pay for a new parking lot. Elias said nothing. He just waited for them to finish, then asked where the auction was being held. The question silenced the room for a heartbeat before the laughter began again. What, you planning to buy one, Marlowe? Gonna use it to scare the crows off your corn? He didn't reply. He just paid for his feed and left, the sound of their amusement following him out the door like dust. At the auction yard the next day, the wind was dry and hot, carrying the smell of oil and rust. The turbine's components lay scattered across the ground tower sections streaked with red, blades warped and cracked, the generator housing blackened by weather. The auctioneer stood on the bed of a truck, reading off numbers that no one wanted to bid on. One by one, the lots passed without a single raised hand. The crowd was small, mostly scrap dealers and mechanics looking for salvageable metal. When the auctioneer finally reached the turbine from the Marlowe Ridge, his voice faltered. Lot 32 wind generator, 40 meters, condition, scrap, starting bid, $50. The silence that followed was filled with the buzz of flies. Then Elias lifted his hand. There was a pause, a few startled glances, and then the laughter began again, low at first, then spreading through the crowd like a ripple in dry grass. The auctioneer blinked, clearly relieved to have any bid at all, and brought his gavel down. "Sold to Mr. Marlowe." He said it quickly, as if afraid the farmer might change his mind. Elias nodded once and turned away. The men were still laughing behind him as he walked back to his truck, but their voices sounded far away, carried off by the wind. It took him 3 days to arrange transport for the parts. The truck drivers shook their heads when they saw the load. "You sure about this, old man?" one of them asked, watching as Elias supervised the loading of the blades. "That thing's nothing but rust and regret." Elias only said, "She's still standing, isn't she?" The drivers exchanged looks, shrugged, and went back to work. The convoy crawled along the dirt road to his farm, the sound of chains rattling with every bump. Children ran alongside, shouting and pointing. Women came out onto porches to watch. By the time the trucks reached his field, the whole valley knew. Elias Marlowe had bought himself a dead windmill. They left the pieces at the edge of his land, near the old grain silo. The ground shook when the tower sections were lowered, and dust rose in thick clouds that clung to the air. Elias paid the drivers, thanked them, and stood alone beside the pile of metal. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the field, and the turbine's remains glowed a deep, weary red. From the road behind him came the faint echo of laughter and a voice calling out, "Hey, Marlowe, you building yourself a spaceship?" He didn't answer. The joke drifted away with the dust. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the lamp flickering beside him, and watched the silhouette of the tower pieces against the horizon. The fields were silent, the crickets stilled by the heat. Somewhere in the dark, the wind shifted, whispering through the grass. It seemed to him that the sound came from the metal itself, a faint murmur, like something alive struggling to remember how to breathe. He rose, went outside, and crossed the field barefoot. The air smelled of rust and rain that hadn't yet fallen. When he reached the turbine, he laid his hand on the cold steel. It was rough, pitted, unyielding. But beneath the surface he felt a trace of warmth, the day's heat lingering inside. For a long moment he stood there, hand on the metal, the stars trembling above him. Then he nodded once, as if answering an unspoken challenge. Morning found him already at work. He began by clearing the weeds and cutting away the vines that had wrapped themselves around the base. The first week passed in silence, except for the clatter of tools and the rustle of wind through the grass. People driving by slowed their trucks to watch. Some waved mockingly. Others shook their heads, pity softening into disbelief. By evening, the news had spread from one end of the valley to the other. Marlowe was trying to rebuild the windmill. They said it with laughter, but there was something else behind the amusement. Now, something uneasy, because everyone knew that Elias Marlowe did not start things he couldn't finish. Days turned into weeks. His hands blistered, his back ached, and still he worked. The tower began to stand again, section by section, though it leaned and groaned under its own weight. From afar it looked like a monument to stubbornness, a thing that refused to stay dead. The townspeople kept their distance, but every evening someone would drive out just to see if he had given up. He never did. When the sun went down, his lantern burned late into the night, a small point of light at the edge of the darkened valley. One evening, his brother came from a neighboring county to see the spectacle. George Marlowe was younger, heavier, more practical. He stood beside the pile of tools and stared up at the tower. "You really think you can make this thing spin again?" he asked, though there was more sadness than mockery in his voice. Elias didn't answer. He simply tightened a bolt and wiped the sweat from his face. George sighed, looked at the darkening sky, and said, "You're chasing ghosts, Eli. There's nothing left in that heap but rust." Elias looked up then, his eyes reflecting the last of the sunlight. "There's wind," he said quietly. "That's enough." After his brother left, the laughter of the valley grew louder, sharper, as though trying to drown the echo of his conviction. At the general store they joked about Marlowe's folly, about the wind prophet, and his iron cross. But in the quiet hours, when the wind carried over the fields, the people who mocked him could see the faint gleam of his lantern moving among the girders. They didn't say it aloud, but some of them began to wonder what kept him going. Elias didn't think of them. He thought only of the tower and the wind. To him they were no longer separate things, but two halves of a single, unfinished story. The tower had been built to harness the wind, and the wind, indifferent and eternal, waited for someone stubborn enough to try again. In its silence, he found a reflection of his own persistence, a promise that neither of them was truly finished. When the first real storm of autumn rolled in, the sky bruised with thunder, he stood beneath the rising tower and watched the clouds churn. The wind screamed across the hills, whipping his coat around his legs, and the steel above him groaned in reply. Rain began to fall, thin at first, then heavy, blurring the horizon. He stayed where he was, gripping the base of the structure, feeling the vibration of it through his bones. It was madness, he knew that. But it was a madness that felt more alive than all the years of cautious reason that had come before. By the time the storm passed, the fields were flooded, the ground littered with branches and debris. The tower stood battered but upright, and Elias was still there, soaked to the skin, his eyes bright in the gray dawn. He turned toward his house, the wind tugging at his sleeves, and felt something in him settle, a kind of peace he hadn't known since his wife was alive. The laughter of the valley no longer reached him. In its place was the whisper of the wind, calling from the ridge, reminding him that even dead things could wake again if someone believed long enough. That night, as the fog crept back over the fields and the lights of the village flickered below, Elias sat on his porch and watched the tower's dark shape against the sky. The stars moved behind its blades like slow embers. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with failure and fatigue, but he also knew that he would not turn back. The wind had spoken, and he had answered. The valley slept, unaware that its stillness was about to change, that one man's stubbornness would soon draw breath back into the lungs of the dead machine. And when the wind rose again before dawn, sweeping through the grass with a low, rhythmic hum, it carried with it a promise, a whisper of motion waiting to be born. The weeks that followed the storm brought a strange rhythm to Elias Marlowe's life. Each morning he rose before the sun, brewed coffee strong enough to cut through the ache in his bones, and walked out toward the ridge where the tower stood like a wounded giant against the pale horizon. The land was damp from the rains, and the air smelled of iron and wet earth. The fields glistened faintly under the fading stars. From his porch he could already see it, the half-rebuilt turbine, its naked frame cutting across the sky. It was no longer just a monument of rust. It was beginning, in the dim light, to look like something alive again, though fragile and uncertain, like a creature learning how to stand. He worked in silence. The clang of his hammer and the grinding of old bolts were the only sounds that broke the stillness. Sometimes crows circled overhead, drawn by curiosity or habit, their cries echoing faintly through the valley. By midday, the sun burned through the last mist, and the distant shimmer of the highway became visible far below. On some days, a truck would slow on the road, its driver leaning out to stare, perhaps to laugh, before driving on. The world of the valley had turned its attention toward him, and though he pretended not to notice, he could feel their eyes following his every movement. The laughter had begun even before the storm, but now it grew bolder. People no longer whispered about him in passing. They spoke openly. The Marlowe farm, once unremarkable, had become a kind of theater. The men at the feed store joked about charging admission. Women on their porches shook their heads when they saw him hauling lengths of pipe or dragging tools up the hill. Children made a game of it, chasing one another down the road with their arms spinning like blades, shouting, "I'm the crazy windman," before collapsing in laughter. In the evenings, when Elias walked into town for supplies, conversations fell quiet until he had passed, and then the chuckles rose again behind his back like a swarm of gnats. It would have been easier if the laughter had been cruel. Cruelty he could have met with silence or stubborn defiance, but the laughter of the valley was not born of malice. It came from something smaller and sadder, an inability to believe in what did not already fit the pattern of their lives. To them, he was not dangerous or deranged. He was simply foolish, a man who had confused the whisper of the wind with a calling. They pitied him even as they mocked him, and that pity was harder to bear than hate. He began to feel the weight of their gaze even when he was alone. Sometimes, while tightening a bolt or welding a seam, he would sense eyes upon him, only to glance around and see nothing but the fields. The sound of distant laughter seemed to linger in the wind itself. At night, lying in his narrow bed, he would hear it again in memory, The murmured jokes, the good-natured disbelief, and feel the old familiar ache of solitude press against his ribs. But he rose every dawn just the same, because something inside him was more relentless than humiliation. His progress was slow. Every step forward brought a new obstacle. The bolts that held the tower's midsection were fused with rust, impossible to move without heat. The generator casing was cracked, its wiring eaten by rats. The old bearings had seized into a solid block of iron, yet for all its decay, the machine possessed a strange dignity. Even in ruin, it refused to collapse. Elias often paused to study the lines of the tower against the sky, the way it leaned but did not fall, the symmetry still visible beneath corrosion, and felt an odd kinship with it. They were both things the valley had left behind. They both endured because they did not know how to do otherwise. When the days grew shorter, the work became harder. He carried lanterns up the hill to continue after dark, their lights swaying in the wind like yellow stars. Sometimes from the road below, travelers saw the glow and mistook it for the fire of lightning bugs clustered around the tower. Others whispered that Marlowe was experimenting with electricity, that he was calling down lightning to feed his contraption. The stories multiplied faster than truth could follow. Someone said he'd gone blind from welding without goggles. Another claimed he had built a secret generator inside his barn, powered by some unnatural current. Each tale passed from mouth to mouth until they reached the diner at the edge of town, where the old men drank coffee and declared with certainty that Elias Marlowe had lost his mind. He heard most of it when he went into town for nails or grease. The storekeepers smiled politely, but their eyes gleamed with curiosity. "Still working on that windmill, Eli?" they would ask. "Got it singing yet?" The words were friendly enough, but beneath them lay the same laughter as always. He would nod, pay for his goods, and leave without explanation. There was no sense in arguing with those who had already decided that faith was folly. His sister came to visit in October, driving from 2 towns over. Clara had always been the gentler of the 2 Marlowe siblings, but even her kindness was edged with worry. She brought food, sat at his kitchen table, and tried to speak of ordinary things, of neighbors, of the drought in the next county, of her grandchildren. But her eyes kept drifting toward the window, where the shadow of the half-rebuilt tower stretched across the fields. At last she said quietly, "Eli, what are you doing up there? You're not young anymore. It's dangerous. And for what?" He didn't look at her. "You remember when we were children," he said instead, "and Father fixed the old wind pump behind the barn? Everyone said it couldn't work again, but he kept at it. He said the trick was listening to the wind." She sighed, realizing that argument was useless. When she left, she pressed his hand and whispered, "Just don't let it take you with it." He watched her drive away, the dust of her tires fading into the sunset, and returned to the ridge without another word. The valley's patience for eccentricity thinned as the months passed. The laughter turned sharper, carrying a trace of irritation. People began to mutter that Marlowe's obsession was becoming dangerous. Children were told not to play near his farm. The preacher at Sunday service warned of the sin of pride of men who sought to raise towers to the heavens instead of tilling the earth as they were meant to. No one mentioned Elias by name, but everyone understood. He sat in the back pew, head bowed, hands folded on his knees. The sermon droned on, full of gentle admonition, and he listened without anger. Pride, he thought, was not what drove him. It was something simpler, something older. The refusal to let the wind die. One afternoon, as he worked beneath the shadow of the tower, a group of boys rode by on bicycles. They stopped at the fence and called out, asking if he had managed to make the big fan spin yet. He told them gently to go home before they hurt themselves. They laughed, climbed the fence, and ran up the slope to the base of the tower. He watched them clamber up the lower rungs of the ladder, shrieking with glee until one of them slipped and scraped his knee. The laughter turned to tears, and the boys fled down the hill, leaving behind echoes that stung sharper than any insult. That night Elias sat on his porch, staring at the dark silhouette of the tower, and felt an ache he hadn't felt since his sons were small. The valley could laugh all it wanted. The children didn't know better. But it was the silence that followed their laughter, the emptiness of it that pressed hardest on his chest. Winter crept in slowly, frosting the fields and turning the roads to mud. Elias worked less during the coldest weeks, forced indoors by the wind that cut through his coat. The isolation deepened. He spoke to no one for days at a time, except to the dog that followed him from the barn to the house. Yet the tower never left his mind. When snow fell, he brushed it from the metal. When ice formed, he chipped it away, whispering under his breath as though to comfort a wounded friend. Sometimes in the still hours before dawn, he would imagine that the tower whispered back, not in words, but in the creak of its joints, in the faint hum that passed through its frame when the wind pressed against it just so. In town, his name had become a shorthand for futility. Pulling a Marlowe, they called it, when someone wasted time on a hopeless task. Even the preacher used it once, half in jest, during a sermon about misplaced faith. The people laughed. But one evening, as the sun sank behind the hills and the valley lay quiet, a few of those same men stood outside the tavern and saw, far off in the fading light, the shape of Elias Marlowe still climbing his tower. The wind whipped around him, tugging at his coat. The lantern at his belt swung in wide arcs. For a moment the setting sun caught the glass, and the whole figure seemed a glow man and machine blurred together, one creature made of flesh and steel. The laughter faltered on their lips. None of them spoke, and when they finally turned away, they did so more quickly than usual. That night the wind rose again. In his house, Elias sat by the fire, his hands raw from labor. Outside, the tower groaned under the force of the storm, but its base held firm. He imagined the valley below, all its lights flickering in windows, all its people warm and certain in their dismissal of him. A quiet smile touched his mouth. Let them laugh. They did not know the sound of wind against iron, the way it carried the rhythm of the earth itself. They did not know how silence could be reshaped into strength. He closed his eyes, listening to the deep hum of the storm, and in that moment he felt again what he had felt the first night he touched the cold metal. A faint stirring, a heartbeat not his own. When dawn came, the fields were slick with frost, and the hills shimmered under a pale glaze. The tower stood black against the brightening sky, unbroken, unbent. Elias stepped out onto his porch, breath fogging in the chill, and looked up. The wind moved through the blades with a low sigh, like something asleep but dreaming. He tightened his coat, picked up his tools, and began the climb once more. Below him, the valley still slept, wrapped in the comfort of disbelief. Above him stretched only the sky, and in it the whisper of the wind waiting to be woken. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, Elias was already working, his movement steady and sure. The laughter of the valley had not stopped, but it no longer mattered. It had become part of the landscape, like the rust, like the wind itself, something to endure, not to answer. And somewhere deep within the tower, beneath layers of iron and memory, he thought he heard an answering sound, a hollow note, faint but real, like the promise of breath returning to a long-forgotten body. The laughter of the valley faded into the distance, and the day began again with the wind. By the time spring began to lean over the valley again, Elias Marlowe had grown into the shape of his work. The rhythm of his days had become indistinguishable from the rhythm of the wind itself, steady, restless, and eternal. Each morning he rose before dawn, his body aching yet obedient, and climbed the ridge with his tools slung over his shoulder. The frost still clung to the grass, and his breath hung in the air like pale smoke. Behind him, the farmhouse stood small and solitary against the fields, a single patch of human warmth in a world that had already forgotten him. But ahead of him, silhouetted against the brightening sky, the tower waited. It rose like a skeleton of the past, scarred and stubborn, defying both time and mockery. The laughter of the valley no longer reached his ears as it once had. It had become background noise, a dull hum that dissolved into the same wind that turned his hair gray and his hands to stone. The first weeks of spring brought with them both hope and hardship. The thaw had loosened the earth, and with it came the weight of old failures. The bolts he had managed to free during the cold months had rusted again. The ground at the base of the tower had shifted, and one of the supporting braces had bent. He spent entire days lying on his back beneath the massive structure, hammering, tightening, bracing, until the skin on his palms tore. The smell of oil and rust clung to his clothes, mixed with the faint sweetness of new grass. When he returned home at night, his body was a map of bruises and cuts. But as the days lengthened, so too did his determination. The pain that once reminded him of age now reminded him of progress. He began to think less of what the tower had been and more of what it might yet become. It was no longer merely a structure of iron and bolts. It was a living thing, wounded but breathing. He could hear its voice in every creak and groan of its frame. When the wind swept through its hollow vents, the sound was no longer mournful but searching, as if the tower itself wanted to rise again. Elias listened as one listens to a sick friend, his ear attuned to every tremor, every whisper of change. He came to understand its moods, the way it shuddered before rain, the way it stiffened in the heat of noon. In return, it taught him patience. His work grew more intricate. The days of clearing and scraping were behind him. Now he was rebuilding. He disassembled the generator housing, cleaned its inner coils, and replaced the corroded wiring with copper salvaged from an old tractor. He melted scrap metal in a makeshift forge he had built behind the barn. The anvil rang late into the night, scattering sparks that danced like fireflies. Old plow blades became brackets, wagon rims became rings, and rusted nails became new bolts. He moved through this world of metal and fire as if guided by instinct rather than reason, each blow of his hammer echoing against the silent hills. Sometimes, when exhaustion threatened to crush him, he would stop and look out over the valley. From that height, he could see the rooftops of the town, the roads winding like faded scars across the land, the smoke from evening fires curling upward. There was beauty in it, even if it did not love him. The people down there went about their days as if nothing in the world had changed, and perhaps nothing had. Yet he felt that something was shifting, even if only in him. The tower was becoming a mirror for his own endurance, its slow awakening bound to his own stubborn heart. But the body has its limits. One afternoon, while trying to align the lower support girders, the ladder slipped from its brace. Elias fell hard, striking the packed earth below. The impact stole the breath from his lungs, and for a long moment he lay motionless, staring up at the vast, indifferent sky. When he tried to move, pain flared in his shoulder and ribs. He dragged himself upright and limped back to the farmhouse, every step a quiet admission of frailty. For the first time since beginning his work, he was forced to stop. The days that followed were filled with silence. He sat by the window, his arm bound in a sling, and watched the tower through the shifting light. It stood there as always, waiting, its shadow cutting across the field like a sundial of iron. He felt the restlessness of the wind, but could do nothing. The stillness gnawed at him. Without the sound of tools, the farm seemed to fall asleep. Dust gathered on his workbench, and the lantern in the barn grew cold. At night he dreamed of the tower collapsing, of its blades shattering into dust, and woke with a start to find only the whisper of the wind outside his door. When the pain finally lessened, he returned to the ridge. The air was warmer now, filled with the scent of wet earth and wildflowers. His steps were slower, but his resolve was sharper than ever. The tower loomed above him, silent and expectant, and for a moment he simply stood there, letting the wind wash over him. He felt as if he were being welcomed back, forgiven for his brief absence. Climbing the ladder with his good arm, he reached the midpoint and laid his hand against the steel. The surface was cold, yet it seemed to hum faintly under his palm, as though acknowledging his return. From that day forward, he began to treat the tower not as a machine, but as a companion. He spoke to it when he worked, murmuring under his breath about the weather, the crops, the stubbornness of rust. The habit would have seemed mad to anyone else, but to Elias it was natural. The wind carried his words away, blending them with the groan of the metal, and sometimes he fancied he heard answers in return. The isolation that had once weighed on him now became a kind of communion. There was solace in the work, in the repetition of hammer and wrench, in the feel of the tower's weight beneath his hands. Spring ripened into early summer, and with it came progress. The lower braces held firm now, and the tower no longer swayed in the wind. He managed to lift the generator casing back into place using a system of pulleys he'd built himself. When it locked with a satisfying clang, he laughed, a brief, incredulous sound that startled even him. The laughter echoed across the ridge, startling a flock of starlings into flight. It was the first sound of joy to come from that hill in years. Yet joy was a fragile thing in the valley. When the townspeople saw him hauling more supplies up the ridge, their laughter resumed, though less freely than before. A few of them came to watch, leaning against the fence posts with folded arms. One of them called out, asking if he was planning to build a ladder to heaven. Ellis said nothing, tightening another bolt. Their laughter rolled across the fields, but this time it no longer pierced him. He had grown accustomed to its weight. It was part of the air now, as natural as the wind itself. The nights were his own. After supper, he would light his lantern and return to the ridge. Under the starlight, the tower gleamed faintly, and the fields shimmered like an ocean of silver. The sound of his hammer carried for miles, mingling with the cries of night birds. To some, the sight of that solitary light moving among the girders must have seemed haunting. To him, it was holy. In those hours, he felt closest to the truth of what he was doing. The wind, the steel, the fire, all of it spoke the same language, one of endurance and transformation. The tower was no longer an object of ridicule. It had become a covenant between man and nature. As his strength returned, he began the delicate work inside the nacelle, where the blades would one day turn again. The confined space smelled of oil and dust. He cleaned it inch by inch, replaced the bearings, and reassembled the housing. The work demanded precision, and more than once he struck his hand against the sharp edges, leaving streaks of blood across the metal. He wrapped the wounds with cloth and kept working. Each cut, each bruise, felt like an offering, a part of himself given to the machine. It was as if the tower demanded a toll in flesh for every inch of progress, and he paid it without hesitation. Weeks passed, and little by little the tower began to take shape as it once had. The blades were still missing, but their mounts gleamed in the sunlight. The generator's heart, long dead, had begun to thrum faintly when turned by hand. It was not power yet, not life, but the first stirrings of it, the heartbeat of something waking after a long sleep. Elias found himself listening for it even when he wasn't working. At night, lying in bed, he could almost hear it through the walls, a low vibration that matched the rhythm of his own pulse. But the work was far from over. There were days when exhaustion drove him to his knees, when his hands shook too badly to hold a wrench, when the valley seemed to conspire against him with its heat and its endless dust. On those days, he would sit in the shadow of the tower and rest his back against the steel, letting the wind move through his hair. He would close his eyes and imagine that he was not alone, that the tower breathed beside him, that the wind which brushed his face was not indifferent but kind. In those moments, he understood something that words could not express, that life, even in its smallest flicker, was built from resistance. By midsummer, the fields below shimmered with heat, and the earth cracked beneath the sun. The laughter in town had grown quieter. People still joked about him, but their voices lacked conviction. The stories they told had begun to change. Some said he had discovered a new way to harness the wind. Others said he had built a shrine to his dead wife. Children who once mocked him now whispered that he could talk to storms. The truth was simpler, but none of them could see it. He was building not for glory or madness, but for meaning. One evening, as the last light drained from the sky, Elias climbed to the top of the tower and stood there, wind whipping at his clothes. The world below was vast and still, the fields golden in the fading sun. The metal beneath his feet vibrated softly, resonating with the steady hum of the breeze. He closed his eyes and let the sound fill him. For the first time in many years, he felt whole. He was no longer a man fighting against time and ridicule. He was part of something larger, something enduring. The line between flesh and iron had blurred, and in that union, there was peace. When he descended, the stars were already bright above the hills. The valley lay silent, unaware of the quiet transformation taking place on its edge. Tomorrow the work would continue as it always did, and the wind would rise again. But tonight, as Elias walked home with his lantern swinging at his side, he felt the tower's presence behind him, a dark sentinel watching over the fields, alive with the promise of motion. And though his body ached and his hands bled, his heart was light, for he knew that the time of silence was ending, and that soon the wind would speak again. By the time summer settled across the valley, The fields shimmered with dust and heat, and the air carried the dry scent of wheat ready for harvest. Elias Marlowe had long ceased to count the days. They had melted into one another like the layers of rust he scraped from the tower, each moment consumed by the same endless rhythm of effort, failure, and persistence. The wind turbine now stood whole in form, if not yet in life. Its body rose clean and straight against the sky, stripped of decay and clothed once more in the dull gleam of new steel. The three great arms that had once powered its motion were gone, replaced by temporary beams that waited for the final blades. It was a creature poised between death and resurrection, silent yet trembling on the edge of movement. The laughter that had once filled the valley had grown scarce. The townspeople still talked, still exchanged glances when he passed, but their amusement had cooled into unease. There was something unsettling about the constancy of one man's will. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they could see the light of his lantern glimmering high above the fields, moving across the tower like a star that refused to set. Some said he was haunted. Others said he was blessed. A few whispered that perhaps the wind had chosen him, but none dared come close now. The mockery that had once seemed harmless no longer fit the silence that surrounded his work. Inside that silence, Elias had learned to move with precision and patience. The smallest mistake could undo weeks of progress. Each bolt, each joint, each wire had to be coaxed into alignment. He spent entire afternoons inside the generator housing, his hands black with grease, his shirt soaked with sweat. The valley's heat pressed on him like a hand, and the metal walls of the tower turned the air thick and stifling. But he welcomed the exhaustion. It dulled thought and left only instinct. He no longer questioned why he continued. The purpose had become the air he breathed. It was not ambition that drove him anymore, nor pride, it was need, the simple, raw need to finish what he had begun. The first true test came in late July, when the wind began to rise. The sky darkened in the west, heavy with the promise of rain. Elias had been working through the afternoon, tightening the last series of bolts along the rotor shaft. His fingers were numb from the vibrations of the wrench when the first gust struck, rattling the tower like a living thing. He stepped back and looked up. The clouds had gathered with a swiftness that made the horizon vanish. The wheat bent low, rippling like water, and the wind sang through the valley's hollows. It was the same voice he had heard for months in his sleep, wild, ancient, and impatient. The tower shuddered, its frame groaning, and for the first time Elias felt not the defiance of metal, but its anticipation. He lit the lantern, though daylight still lingered, and climbed to the top platform. The storm wind roared around him, flinging dust into his eyes, tugging at his clothes with invisible hands. Below, the valley blurred into a single movement of golden gray. When he reached the nacelle, he crouched beside the generator housing and waited. The temporary beams creaked under the pressure of the wind. The tower swayed, but it held. Elias closed his eyes. He could feel the breath of the storm pressing against the machine, the invisible weight of air yearning to be caught and transformed. For a long time he remained there, motionless, until the first drops of rain struck his face. Then, as if by instinct, he released the brake on the shaft. The reaction was almost imperceptible at first, a faint tremor, a shift too subtle to trust. But then came the sound, a slow, rasping moan as the beams began to move. The structure groaned in protest, but the motion grew, steady, certain. The great body of the turbine stirred, its rusted heart remembering what it had been. Elias held his breath, afraid even to move, as the mechanism creaked toward life. And then, in a burst of sound that seemed to split the air, the rotor turned. Once, twice. A deep metallic hum rose from within the housing, low and trembling. The light from his lantern flickered. He reached out and felt the faintest vibration beneath his palm, weak, uneven, but real. For the first time in 2 decades, the tower had drawn breath. When the storm broke fully, he locked the system again and descended, soaked and shaking. The valley was a blur of rain and thunder. The wind lashed across the fields and lightning flared over the hills. In that chaos, the turbine stood upright, its outline illuminated for a heartbeat by each flash of light, as though heaven itself were watching. Elias reached the ground and looked back. The blades had not yet been attached, but the tower moved as though straining to meet the storm, the great shaft within humming faintly under the wind's assault. He laughed then, not loudly, but with the quiet disbelief of a man who has seen the impossible made flesh. The following morning dawned clear and pale. The valley shimmered under a sheen of dew. When Elias emerged from his house, the ground smelled of fresh rain, and the air carried the sweetness of renewal. He climbed the ridge again, unsure if what he had witnessed had been real or only a dream born of exhaustion. But as he approached, he heard it, the soft, rhythmic tick of the metal cooling after the storm, and beneath it, the faint vibration still pulsing within the generator. He placed his ear against the steel and smiled. The heart was weak, but it was beating. That day, when he went into town for wire and grease, the laughter returned, but different now, thinner, uncertain. Men leaned on counters and asked, half joking, if the old windmill had finally taken flight. Elias only said, "It moved," and walked away. The simplicity of his answer unsettled them. When the story spread, it carried an edge of disbelief that bordered on fear. The valley had lived too long in the comfort of ridicule. It had never considered that the thing it mocked might one day answer back. From then on, Elias worked with renewed purpose. He replaced the temporary beams with the real blades, 3 vast arms of steel and fiberglass, scavenged from a decommissioned turbine in another county. The work was slow and dangerous. The blades were heavy, unwieldy, their surfaces reflecting the sun in blinding arcs. He had to rely on pulleys and crude scaffolds, every movement measured and deliberate. His hands bled anew, the skin splitting along old scars. Yet he felt stronger than he had in years. Every wound was proof that he was still alive, that the tower was no longer a tomb, but a living extension of his own endurance. By August, the valley had begun to take notice. The laughter had faded into silence. Wagons slowed on the road, their drivers watching in uneasy fascination. Children no longer mocked him. They watched instead, wide-eyed, as the turbine rose complete, its blades gleaming white against the blue. It stood taller than any barn, any tree, its shadow stretching far across the golden fields. At sunset, when the light struck its edges, it glowed like a beacon. People spoke of it in whispers, unsure whether to call it madness or miracle. Elias heard none of this. He had stopped listening long ago. The only sound that mattered was the hum of the wind. When the last bolt was tightened and the tower stood ready, he waited. The days were still and breathless, the air heavy with dust. It seemed as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then one evening, as the sky darkened into violet, a breeze stirred. The wheat rippled faintly, a ripple that grew into a wave. Elias felt it before he saw it, the slow awakening of air across the valley, the whisper that signaled change. He climbed to the platform and stood beside the massive blades. The wind pressed against them, tentative at first, then stronger. The tower groaned once, shuddered, and began to move. The blades turned with a low, uneven rhythm, slicing the air in long, laboring arcs. The sound was unlike anything Elias had ever heard, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through his bones. He held onto the railing, watching the motion quicken. The generator housing beneath him hummed, faint at first, then louder, steadier. The wind's voice filled his ears, a song of power and defiance, of life rediscovered. He laughed aloud, the sound lost in the roar of air and steel. Below, the valley lights flickered as dusk fell, unaware that history had shifted on the ridge above. When night came fully, he descended and walked toward his house, the turbines spinning steadily behind him. The stars shone brighter than they had in years. He lit a lamp, connected the cables he had laid from the tower, and waited. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a faint crackle, the bulb flickered to life. A steady, golden glow filled the room. He stared at it in silence, the light trembling across his calloused hands. After months of labor, the tower had finally given something backlight drawn from the breath of the sky. He worked late into the night, checking the gauges, adjusting the wiring, measuring the current. When he stepped outside again, the turbine still turned, slower now but constant. The wind had calmed, yet the blades continued their lazy rotation, catching even the gentlest breeze. Elias sat on the porch, his tools beside him, and watched. The sound of the tower filled the air, low, rhythmic, alive. It was not the moan of decay he had first heard months ago. It was the heartbeat of a creature reborn. In the following days, word spread through the valley that the Marlowe farm had light. At first, people dismissed it as rumor, but one evening, a group of children saw the faint glow from his windows and ran home to tell their parents. Soon others came to see for themselves, standing by the road, staring up at the ridge where the tower spun slowly against the fading sky. Some laughed again, but softly now, without conviction. Others said nothing at all. The laughter that had once united them now divided them, because what they saw defied the certainty of their scorn. Elias did not invite them in. He remained on the ridge, tending to the tower, adjusting its rhythm as one might soothe a restless animal. The turbine responded with patience, its motion smoothing, its hum deepening. Each night it drew breath more easily, and each morning the light in his house burned brighter. He no longer felt the sting of loneliness. The valley might still doubt him, but the wind had chosen its ally, and that was enough. One evening, after a long day of repairs, he stood by the tower as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was streaked with crimson and gold, and the air was thick with the scent of rain. The wind moved gently around him, warm and steady. He laid his hand against the steel and closed his eyes. Beneath his palm he felt it again, the pulse of motion, the vibration of something vast and alive. The turbine turned, smooth and sure, and the sound it made was almost human, a sigh of relief, a breath drawn after years of silence. The valley would continue to laugh, he knew. They would find new jokes, new explanations. But none of that mattered anymore. The tower no longer needed their belief, and neither did he. Together they had endured the mockery and the storms. Together they had proved that even what is called dead can rise again when touched by patience and will. As darkness settled across the fields, Elias Marlowe stood beside his tower and watched the blades turn against the stars. The wind had awoken, and through it, so had he. The valley had grown used to its routines. Fields tended at dawn, the hum of machinery, the faint glow of porch lights against the evening haze. For years it had drifted through seasons with the quiet indifference of habit, its people anchored by certainty. Yet in the late days of autumn, that certainty began to tremble. The storms that usually came from the west never arrived, and the sky, though heavy with clouds, refused to give rain. Then one night, without warning, the power died. It began with a flicker lights dimming across the hillsides, the soft hum of refrigerators cutting to silence. Within minutes, the entire valley was swallowed by darkness. The hum of the modern world vanished, replaced by a vast, uneasy quiet. Elias Marlowe was awake when it happened. He had been working by lamplight, recording the turbine's output in a worn notebook, his pen scratching softly over paper. When the lamp on his table sputtered and went out, he looked up, puzzled. He waited for the power to surge back, as it always did after a line failure. But the silence that followed was complete. Outside, the wind was still blowing steadily from the north, a long whispering breath across the fields. He rose, stepped to the window, and saw nothing. No glimmer of town lights, no movement, only a black horizon. He understood at once what it meant. Somewhere down the valley, the grid had failed, perhaps from age, perhaps from neglect. He took up his coat, lit his lantern, and stepped outside. The night air was cold and the stars were dimmed by a faint haze of dust. Above him, his tower stood tall and motionless, its blades barely stirring in the dark. He could feel the weight of the silence pressing against his chest, heavier than the night itself. For years he had labored to bring this machine to life, to carve purpose from its ruin. Now the world around him had gone still, and for the first time it seemed the valley had come to match his solitude. He climbed the ridge slowly, the lantern swinging at his side. The path was uneven, scattered with stones and tufts of dry grass. As he walked, the distant cries of animals carried faintly through the air, the restlessness of livestock sensing the loss of light. At the crest he turned and looked down. The town below was invisible, its streets dark, its windows blank. Only the faint outline of roofs could be seen against the dim reflection of the sky. It was as if the valley itself had been erased. He turned back to the tower, Its form loomed above him like a mountain of steel, black against black. The blades creaked faintly, catching the breath of wind. He placed a hand on the ladder, cold beneath his fingers, and began to climb. Each rung sang a low note as his boots struck it. The air thinned as he ascended, the wind stronger near the top. When he reached the platform, he set down the lantern and gazed out over the land. Nothing moved. The stillness of the valley was complete, yet above him the turbines shivered as if sensing his thoughts. For a long time he simply listened to the wind brushing against the tower, to the faint tick of metal contracting in the cold. Then he moved to the control box, opened it, and checked the dials. The system was alive, ready. The wind was steady enough. Slowly, almost reverently, he disengaged the brake and adjusted the pitch of the blades. At first they hesitated, then began to turn with a low sigh. The sound rose and fell with the rhythm of the air, steady, unhurried. The generator within the housing groaned, caught, and began to hum. A tremor passed through the steel beneath his feet. He watched as the needle on the gauge rose 10, 20, 30. The vibration deepened. The hum became a steady growl, then a pulse, alive and strong. The air around the tower seemed to change, filled with invisible motion. He felt it through his boots, through his bones. The turbine had awakened again, answering the night. He closed the box, lifted the lantern, and descended. By the time he reached the ground, the wind had strengthened. The blades turned faster now, slicing the air with a low roar. The tower's heartbeat echoed through the soil, a sound both mechanical and primal. Elias crossed to the small transformer shed he had built at the base and threw the main switch. The cables that ran from the tower to his house and beyond thrummed with life. A faint light flickered in the distance, his farmhouse windows glowing amber through the dark. He smiled, the expression slow and weary. But that was only the beginning. Within an hour, a faint glow appeared farther down the valley, then another. The cables he had quietly laid during the months of his work extensions running toward neighboring farms had begun to carry the current. The turbine's breath flowed outward, reaching the houses that had lost their light. The people within, startled from their beds, saw their lamps flicker back to life, their radios sputter with sound. They looked toward the ridge, saw the faint silhouette of the spinning blades against the stars, and understood. By dawn, a thin haze of smoke rose from the chimneys again. The valley, which had been silent through the night, was alive with voices. Men rode out on horseback and in trucks, following the lines toward Marlowe's farm. They arrived in small groups, faces drawn with fatigue and wonder. Elias met them at the gate, his hands blackened from oil and wind. They asked questions, how he had done it, whether it would hold, if it could last. He told them little. "The wind's been waiting," he said simply. "We just had to listen." For many, that answer was enough. They helped him adjust the cables, steady the lines, and carry barrels of oil up the hill for the generator. The laughter that once had accompanied his name was gone. In its place came a strange, reverent quiet. They called him the man who caught the wind, half in jest, half in awe. Mothers brought food. Children followed him as he walked to the tower, their eyes wide. And for the first time since he had come to the valley, Elias did not walk alone. The turbine continued to turn through the following days, feeding power into the homes below. When the grid still did not return, more people came. They brought car batteries, broken inverters, cables scavenged from barns. Elias taught them what little he knew how to connect, how to regulate the flow, how to maintain the rhythm of the machine. The wind became their common language. In the evenings, as the sun bled across the horizon, families gathered near the base of the ridge, watching the blades cut through the fading light. The sound of the turbine had changed now. It was not just a hum, but a pulse that seemed to echo through the very soil of the valley. But where wonder takes root, envy soon follows. Among those who came to see the tower was Virgil Moore, the wealthiest landowner in the valley. His ranch stretched across the western hills, his wells deep and full. He had been among the first to mock Elias when he bought the turbine, calling it the monument of a madman. Now he came not to laugh, but to measure. He watched the tower with the narrowed eyes of a man accustomed to ownership. "How far does it reach?" he asked. "How much power can it give?" Elias answered honestly, but without warmth. As much as the wind allows. Moore said nothing for a while, then smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. You've done something remarkable, he said at last. Something that belongs to all of us now. Elias looked at him and shook his head. It belongs to the wind, he replied. Moore left without another word, but his expression was one Elias had seen before, the look of a man who cannot bear to see another's miracle unclaimed. The following nights, Elias worked harder than ever. The demand on the turbine grew as more homes drew from its current. He adjusted valves, oiled gears, and reinforced the main supports. The machine responded with strength, its rhythm constant, the hum deeper. At times, standing beneath it, he felt as though the earth itself were breathing with him. Yet even in his satisfaction, he sensed the shadow of what would come. Men like Moore did not rest easily when power shifted, even for a moment. One evening, as he was tightening a set of bolts near the base, 2 trucks approached along the dirt road. Moore and several men stepped out, their expressions polite but cold. They spoke of safety regulations, of permits, of the risk of fire. They said the tower should be inspected by county officials before it caused harm. Elias listened, wiping grease from his hands, and then said quietly, You had years to build something better. You chose not to. Now the valley breathes again, and you want to silence it. Moore's jaw tightened. It's not yours to decide who gets power. Elias met his gaze. It's not yours either. They left soon after, muttering among themselves. For days afterward, rumors spread that the county might seize the turbine, but the people of the valley who had lived through the darkness stood with Elias. When officials came to inspect the structure, they found dozens of families camped around it, their lights powered by its current. The inspector took one look at the children reading by lantern glow, the mothers cooking with electric stoves, and said nothing. He simply tipped his hat and left. That winter, the wind grew fierce again, sweeping across the valley in long, cold gusts. The turbine thrived in it, spinning with a rhythm that seemed almost joyful. At night, when the air was clear, its blades gleamed like silver against the moonlight. The hum reached every corner of the valley, a song of endurance and defiance. And though Elias knew that the world beyond might one day reclaim its control, for now the valley lived by the will of the wind, and by the stubbornness of one man who refused to yield to laughter or to greed. When he stood beneath the tower, watching its blades turn against the sky, he felt something beyond triumph. It was not pride or victory, but belonging. The turbine was no longer his creation. It was part of the land, part of the people who had once scorned him and now depended on him. He thought of his late wife, of her laughter, of the nights they had sat together on the porch listening to storms. He imagined her voice in the wind, telling him that it was enough. The night the lights went out had changed everything. It had stripped away the illusions of progress and comfort, leaving only the raw truth of endurance. The valley had rediscovered its heartbeat, and in its pulse echoed the rhythm of the turbine, steady, relentless, alive. Elias Marlowe, who had once been the valley's fool, stood now as its keeper of light. And as the wind rose again across the ridge, whispering through the steel and across the fields, he closed his eyes and listened. The sound was not laughter now. It was life itself. Winter passed with its quiet cruelty, and by the time the first thaw came to the valley, the wind had changed its voice. It no longer howled through the bare branches or moaned across the roofs of empty barns. It whispered steady and low, as though it were speaking directly to the machine that stood upon the ridge. The turbine had become part of the landscape now, as permanent as the hills that framed it. Its blades turned slow and sure, slicing the sky with patient rhythm. There was no longer laughter from the town, nor gossip from the feed store. The people who once mocked Elias Marlowe now watched him with the kind of wary respect given to those who had proven something beyond ordinary measure. In the months since the blackout, the tower had become not just a curiosity, but a lifeline. Every morning Elias rose before dawn and climbed the ridge as he always had. The routine was unchanged, but the meaning had deepened. The path was packed firm now by the many feet that had walked it, neighbors, children, travelers from nearby towns who came to see the man who caught the wind. He greeted them with the same quiet reserve, answering questions when asked, refusing praise when offered. He was not a man of speeches or boasts. His language was the steady hum of machinery and the soft hiss of wind through metal. It was enough that the valley breathed again. On most days, the air shimmered with a faint vibration. If one stood close to the base of the tower, one could feel it underfoot, the living pulse of motion carried down through the earth. The houses below glowed with the soft light that had returned to them after months of darkness. The sound of laughter had returned to the homes. But it was a different kind now, quieter, grateful, almost reverent. The same men who had once mocked Elias at the auction yard now tipped their hats when he passed. The same women who had shaken their heads at his stubbornness sent bread and warm stew to his porch. And yet, for all their kindness, there was distance in their eyes. They saw in him something that unsettled them, a reminder of how fragile their certainty had been, how easily it could all have slipped into silence if not for the will of one man. But Elias never saw himself as their savior. The work was not an act of heroism, but of necessity. The wind had chosen him because no one else had listened. He still remembered the years of ridicule, the long evenings when the valley's laughter had carried across his fields like a storm of small cruelties. Those memories had not vanished. They lived within him, tempered now into something stronger. Forgiveness had come not as mercy, but as indifference. He had learned that vindication was quieter than anger. It arrived not in triumph, but in the turning of the blades, in the steady hum that drowned out every doubt. Yet peace, like the wind, is never still for long. Word of the Turbine's success spread beyond the valley. Reporters came from the city, their shoes caked with mud as they trudged up the ridge to take photographs and scribble notes. They spoke of innovation and resilience, of the lone farmer who rebuilt the future. Only they wanted stories, not truths, and Elias gave them little to work with. He stood beside the tower, hands folded over the railing, and answered their questions in simple phrases. It wasn't invention, he told them, just patience. They printed his words as though they were poetry, dressing him in titles he never sought: pioneer, visionary, hero. When the newspapers reached town, the people of the valley read them with pride, but also unease. It was one thing for the wind to belong to them. It was another to have strangers claim it in print. Virgil Moore returned again, this time not with anger, but calculation. He came dressed in his finest coat, his boots polished, his manners smooth as oil. He spoke of opportunity, of investors who wished to replicate the Turbine on a grander scale. "You've done something extraordinary, Elias," he said, his voice almost warm. "But think what it could mean if we brought this to every farm in the county. Imagine what it could be if the right men handled it." Elias listened without interruption, his gaze steady. The sky above was pale blue, the blades casting slow-moving shadows across Moore's face. "The right men?" Elias said at last. "The wind doesn't ask who's right. It only asks who's willing to stand in it." Moore smiled thinly, realizing that persuasion would fail where ridicule once had. He left soon after, the dust of his car swirling behind him like a fading threat. In the months that followed, attempts were made to copy what Elias had done. Old towers were dragged out of storage, welded and patched. Men who once dismissed him now took to calling themselves engineers, assembling machines from blueprints they barely understood. A few managed to build small turbines that turned, though none produced the same power. Others failed entirely, their creations collapsing under the first strong wind. Each failure only deepened the legend. The valley began to call Elias's turbine the heart, and some spoke of it as though it were alive, an ancient force reborn through human hands. Travelers came to see it from miles away, and on windy nights, when the blades sang their deep metallic hymn, people said they could hear the echo as far as the next county. Elias did not seek fame, but he could not stop it from finding him. Letters began to arrive, some asking for help, others offering money, partnerships, contracts. He read them at night by the light of the same bulb powered by the turbine's hum, then folded them neatly and set them aside. The work he cared for was not in paper or profit. It was in the sound of motion, the proof that something once dead had found breath again. Sometimes, sitting on his porch, he would close his eyes and listen to the tower's rhythm and think of his wife. He imagined her laughter mingling with the wind, her voice carried across the fields like a blessing. It was then he realized that the tower had never truly been about the valley's salvation. It had been his way of keeping her alive, her memory, her spirit, her belief that even the smallest effort mattered. Spring returned, and with it came new storms. The turbine withstood them all. The blades whirled faster than ever, the hum deepening into a roar that rolled across the valley like thunder. The power lines he had built held steady, feeding light to every home that needed it. For the first time in decades, the valley entered a season of abundance. Crops flourished under the renewed irrigation, machines ran longer, and the fear of scarcity receded. People began to speak of the wind not as an enemy, but as an ally. Where once they cursed it for scattering soil and bending wheat, they now listened for its coming with quiet gratitude. They had learned to live in its rhythm, to feel its presence not as chaos but as continuity. One evening, near the end of spring, Elias felt the first true exhaustion he had known in years. His hands trembled as he carried his tools, and a dull ache had settled in his chest. He finished his rounds, checking the turbine's joints and gauges, then sat at the base to rest. The wind was gentle that night, cool against his face. He watched the blades turn against the moon, the movement slow and fluid, like the heartbeat of some vast creature. His breath came shallow, but he felt no fear. The tower was alive, and through it, so was he. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound, the steady pulse of air through metal, the deep hum of energy flowing through cables. For the first time in his life, he felt that he had truly finished something. When morning came, the sun rose soft and golden over the hills. The valley awoke to find the turbine spinning as always, steady and sure. But Elias Marlowe did not climb the ridge that day. His body was found seated at the base of the tower, his head tilted slightly back, his face calm, almost smiling. His tools lay beside him, his hands still stained with oil. The wind blew through his hair, lifting it gently as though in farewell. Word spread quickly, and by noon the valley had gathered at the ridge. No one spoke. The only sound was the low hum of the turbine above them. In the days that followed, they buried him beneath the hill where the tower's shadow fell each morning. The people who had once laughed now carried his coffin, their hands trembling. The preacher who had once warned of pride spoke of faith instead, faith in endurance, faith in the quiet strength of those who stand alone. When the service ended, the wind rose suddenly, sweeping across the gathered crowd. The turbine turned faster, its blades gleaming bright in the sun, and some said they could hear his name in the wind. Years passed, and the story of Elias Marlowe became legend. Children grew up hearing of the farmer who had bought a dead machine and given it life. The tower still stood, its paint weathered, its metal worn smooth by decades of wind. It provided power still, humming through storms and droughts alike. Travelers who came to the valley would pause on the road to look up at it and listen. Some said the sound was just the wind moving through the blades. Others swore that if one stood there long enough, one could hear something more. A heartbeat, slow and steady, the echo of the man who had refused to let the wind die. And so the valley endured. It no longer laughed at the foolish, for it had learned that folly and faith were sometimes the same thing. The fields flourished, the lights stayed on, and each night as the wind swept through the hills, the tower turned with its ancient grace. In its rhythm lived the memory of patience, of stubbornness, of quiet belief. Elias Marlowe had passed, but his work had not. The wind carried his legacy through every home it touched, whispering the same truth he had lived by, that nothing is ever truly lost if someone still believes it can live again. On clear nights, when the moon rose full over the valley, the blades of the turbines shone like silver. The hum drifted across the darkened fields, reaching the houses below. Families sitting by their stoves would pause to listen, smiling faintly without knowing why. And in that moment, as the wind moved through the wires and the lights flickered gently in their homes, it seemed as though the valley itself was breathing slow, steady, and eternal. If this story moved you, don't just scroll away. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss the next unbelievable twist. Watch our other stories waiting for you, each one more powerful than the last. And share this video with your friends and family because they won't believe what they're about to see.